You might have heard me talking about the fact that there's loads of myths within housing law, particularly homelessness law, and particularly around things like local connection, intentional homelessness, stuff like that, which there's quite a lot of videos on the channel already about that. But what if homelessness law itself is a myth? And you might think, what the hell are you talking about, Mike? I'm basing this on thinking that comes from a book called Sapiens by Noah Yuval Harari. Absolutely fantastic book anyway. Obviously just talking about the kind of the anthropology of human existence, human history, going right back into the, you know, kind of prehistory right through to today. Loads of interesting stuff, like the fact that until there were trains there was no kind of unified time zone. So when you travelled from Manchester to like Leeds or something, you'd have to change your clocks because, yeah, this is the first time that people have been able to travel around fast enough for the universal time to actually matter. But there's this idea very early on in the book that the reason that Homo sapiens survived when Neanderthals and our other kind of cousins or whatever didn't, even though Neanderthals had bigger brains, they were faster, stronger and everything, is the fact that something about Homo sapiens, something about humans, enabled the brain to believe in collective myths. And that enabled amazing cooperation, which Noah Yuval Harari is basically saying that is probably what made the difference and enabled Homo sapiens to survive. And he gives an example of myths. So obviously myths is a very loaded word, kind of comes in with like religious connotations and stuff like that. But what he's really talking about here is the idea that as a species, as a community, as a nation or whatever, we can believe in these collective myths. And he gives an example of the company, the car company Peugeot, and obviously everyone's heard of that. And he basically asks the question, how do you destroy Peugeot? You know, if you blow up the offices, if you blow up the HQ, does that destroy it? No, it doesn't. If you burn all the paperwork, all the legal paperwork and all the kind of documents that make it a limited company, no, it still exists. If you blow up all the cars, if you destroy all the cars, does Peugeot still exist? Yeah, it does. You can't destroy it in the way that you can destroy physical things. And that's because Peugeot, the company, the brand, exists in our minds, exists only in our minds in that sense. And in that way, homelessness law is very similar. It only exists in our minds. It only exists to the extent that we believe it. And I've talked a lot about the channel about this. There's so many people in the homelessness sector, both in councils, which I guess you wouldn't be surprised by, but also in the voluntary sector, also in charities, also in very influential positions in charities, who effectively shrug and basically say, yeah, that's what the law is, but you know, this is how it really is. And they'll kind of like shrug off the Homelessness Code of Guidance by saying, yeah, but that's just guidance. And it's like, well, it's guidance, it's statutory guidance, it's as good as legally binding, but it only works if we're prepared to believe in it. And back when I worked at Bedford Borough Council, I remember my boss saying, and I didn't understand it at the time because I didn't understand the law, but I was talking about rough sleepers and kind of how we, you know, how do we reduce rough sleeping basically. And she just made the comment, the offhanded comment that, you know, no council follows the law when it comes to rough sleepers, you know, in terms of accepting applications and housing people in Section 188 accommodation. And that's, you know, in one sense that's true. You know, it seemed that no one did seem to, you know, no one did seem to follow the law. No one did seem to respect it. But it's one of those weird things where if all you do is believe in it, it suddenly becomes powerful. And I've seen this through countless complaints I've been involved in. When you are butting up against a council officer, it's often a council officer you're butting up against, often a senior one. And, you know, you're quoting the Homelessness Code of Guidance, and they'll say, it might be something really simple like you don't have to be in person to make a homeless application. You can make a homeless application via an email, for example. I remember that was quite an early argument I had with the council. And on the day it mattered, that particular example related to a guy who just come out of prison from another town, who was coming back to Bedford. He'd been living in Bedford all his life. And I wanted to kind of get the process started early by making a homeless application via email just to kind of, you know, ensure there was a roof over his head that night. And the team leader basically was not having it. You know, she was like, no, unless he's here in person, we're not going to take the application. And no matter how much I quoted case law and whatever else I could find, the Code of Guidance or whatever, I couldn't get that overturned on the day. So this guy rough slept that night basically. But because I believed in the law, because I believed that people should follow the law, I then just went through the complaints process quoting those various like authorities on it. I've actually done a video about it in the last year or so on the channel. But because I believed in the law, because I thought this is ridiculous that we've got a senior housing officer whose job, who's very functioning in their career is to discharge the council's duties lawfully, was not basically listening to what the law said. Effectively, I think her kind of justification was, you know, it's too onerous to be following the law to a letter. And it's like, well, that's the way the law works. But it all comes down to how much you're willing to believe in it. So in that case, I made a complaint, made the point, quoted these different authorities and got it upheld. And ever since then in Bedford, I've never had to deal with that problem again. That was back in like 2014, 2015, that case happened. And it was simply because I was willing to believe that the law exists. And I guess, part of the reason I do the channel, part of the reason I do all the training I do, part of the reason I push for this is that I think the rules actually work. The law actually works on homelessness. It's actually a really good way to get people housed. And it has as much power as you're willing to give it. And I'm willing to give it all the power in the world. I'll kind of die on that hill to say that the law is important to follow and that we should follow it. And that it is by nature pedantic. And yes, it is onerous, but that's the council's problem, not homeless people's problem. And so I guess the reason I'm just doing this quick video is just raise the question, get you thinking about it. But I've been thinking recently about what's the point of failure in terms of, when most people who, let's say they work in a charity, they're good people, they do the job because they want to help people out, and yet they struggle to get the council to follow the law. And often there's kind of a pretty straightforward process where they have an individual, they want to get help, they contact the council and say, I think you've got a duty to house this person for X, Y, and Z reasons. They might quote some different authorities on it. And then that housing officer or that kind of senior housing officer often will come back and say, no, you've got it wrong. That's not how it works here. We don't follow they won't say we don't follow the law, but they'll kind of say something that basically means the same thing as that. And as I say, at that point, a lot of people give up. And partly is because often senior housing officers are pretty they're kind of bullies and they're kind of pretty unpleasant about it all. And they kind of, just bark a lot really. But ultimately, the law has got a lot of bite. And if you're just willing to believe in it, and push for it and just make a stand for it basically, and certainly in our early cases when I worked at Just Us, it required us to go all the way to the local government ombudsman just to get the council to accept that very basic things were the law. But after a couple of years of doing that, it began to have an incredibly powerful effect. And I've talked elsewhere about just the change in the way that people who are homeless, particularly single homeless people, are dealt with by Bedford Borough Council. And it does seem to be largely down to just these kind of complaints that we made and the fact that we weren't willing to watch our council not follow the law. And I guess that kind of raises the question, and I was chatting to a housing officer not too long ago, because to follow the law to the letter, in something like the Homelessness Reduction Act, for example, where there are so many kind of twists and turns, so many ridiculous little bits in it, the question is, do you just kind of make a stand for every single little thing that you come across, every single little failure? Do you kind of make a stand about that? Do you die on that hill? And my own answer to that, and I don't know if it's the right answer or not, is that there is a difference between a council not following the law, which is what we'd call maladministration. So they don't kind of write a particular letter, they don't kind of include a particular detail. And then there's maladministration, which causes injustice, which is when it actually matters to a homeless person. Because you'll often see in local government and social care ombudsman decisions that they have found that the council failed to follow the law, but that it didn't actually make any real difference to the homeless person. And they would therefore say, in a perfect world, we'd expect the council to follow the law in every way. But I think for the time being, the way I approach it is I only bother making an issue about something when it's causing injustice to an individual or a community, potentially if it's a kind of a widespread policy or something. But just applying the law is going to make a massive difference, and it's just about being methodical. I can't really it sounds really boring, and kind of the answer to homelessness might just be that we're just methodical with the law. But I think it actually is. It's just about breaking those situations down. So when you get knocked back by a housing officer who says, oh, that's not what we do here, or that's not what the law really is, you go back and check the authorities. You get, kind of look at through the code of guidance. You might want to get a textbook or something like that. Check out what the law says, and if it says what it says, then you die on that hill. You basically take it forward through the complaints process. And I did a video last year about kind of baring your teeth, and I guess this is kind of the same sort of idea, that if a council knows you and they know that you're willing to take it all the way, you're willing to make a stand for the law being followed, they have no defence. They're completely defenceless against that. Often their defences rely on bullying and just kind of delaying and just kind of losing track of complaints and stuff like that. And so you have to be kind of committed to it, and it can take, first kind of few cases will take many months to get resolved, and you have to live with the fact that potentially the person you're trying to help is not helped whilst that process is happening. In one sense, certainly our first cases, we were not able to get people, a roof over people's head immediately. It wasn't until we managed to get through the complaints process. But as I say, once we'd done that for a couple of years, we would just be able to get people housed, almost like shooting fish in a barrel, to be honest. Sometimes, and I've said this elsewhere, and this might seem really arrogant, but we've seen records from the council where literally the fact that our email addresses were copied in when someone made a homeless application, or when someone, kind of had a question for the council, that literally resulted in team leaders, managers telling their staff to follow the law in that case. And that is simply because they knew that we were serious about, kind of taking it to the LGO, complaining about it, making an issue about it. So yeah, as I say, food for thought. I just thought, really, the idea that housing law itself is a myth, and if we just sit around not believing in it and not kind of doing anything about it when it's broken, then yeah, it won't have any power. But if you are willing to do that, it has ridiculous power. And the reason I'm so committed to all this stuff is that I fundamentally don't believe that the supported accommodation model, the staircase model, whatever you want to call it, is in itself an answer to homelessness. Yes, there might be a few people who prefer it, there might be a few people who, you know, kind of do better in it, but in my experience of working in supported accommodation sector is that the vast majority of people would much prefer to be treated according to their legal rights. You know, that's basically it, and that requires us as professionals or as kind of friends or whatever to really dig in and treat these rights as if they are rights. You know, they are rights, but by law, by definition they are, but only if we believe it. I'd be interested to hear if that makes sense. I appreciate it's not a video here where I'm talking about specific bits of law, but I thought, as I say, it might just be good to put it out there, just as an encouragement really for those people. When you're trying to do this, when you're trying to take on a council for the first time, the first few battles will be really, really hard. They will make, the council officers will make it hard for you. They'll be just very unpleasant in my experience. And I guess the answer is you just go through the complaints process, you just quote the law, and you don't kind of get too involved emotionally. And you can't not do that, I appreciate that, but you just kind of, the power's in the law, not about you kind of getting kind of emotional about it. So just by taking it back to square one, making sure the homeless application is done in writing, kind of following the general steps, and when the council doesn't follow the law and it matters to that person, then you actually kind of take it forward through the complaints process. You will very quickly become known to the housing options team, whatever homeless person's unit, and they will very quickly start to take you more seriously. So so again, I mean this as an encouragement really, just for those people out there who kind of get that initial resistance, that initial pushback, and quite often it can make you lose your mind. At some point I will talk about my experience through all this time, because it had a massive toll on my mental health, because I'm literally reading the law here and the council saying, oh, that's not the way it is, and I'm like, well, am I insane? Am I not reading this right? But actually, just by sticking in and kind of digging in for a few years, basically it turned out, the law is very powerful if you're willing to use it.